So I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit and not get off track. I'm a graduate of the Yeshiva of Flatbush, so I did my elementary and high school there. Yeshiva of Flatbush, when I went there, was a very liberal yeshiva. The classes were coeducational. We were always taught to ask questions, no matter what we were studying. So it was a very substantial education. I came from a very Orthodox home. It wasn't Hasidic, but it was very Orthodox. And when I graduated the yeshiva, I had already met my husband, Mark. We were classmates together. It was very difficult to find my place, in many respects, in the Jewish community. I always loved to pray in an Orthodox synagogue because that's what I grew up with. It's what I was comfortable with. But some of the orthodoxy and some of the Orthodox practices bothered me because I was also trained to question. And after I graduated with my PhD years later in Judaic studies, I mainly worked in an academic setting. So I was teaching in medical schools, I was teaching in colleges, because my degree was in medieval Jewish history, but it had a focus on medieval medical history, Jewish medical history. My husband was going to medical school, my brother was a physician. That's where my interest lay. And during Mark's internship and his residency, we traveled a lot. So it was difficult to maintain a position. I was commuting back and forth to New York to teach at Downstate Medical Center, at other places, depending on where we were living. And after the kids started, we moved back to New York and the children started Hebrew school. I ended up beginning to work in the Hebrew school system in an Orthodox synagogue in White Plains because they had a very strong Hebrew program. And I wanted my children to learn Hebrew, even though they weren't in a yeshiva. And I was sitting and working in the office, and the principal came in a panic. One of her teachers had just noticed her that she was pregnant, and the class didn't have any coverage. And she walks in, she sees I'm reading a book, waiting for my children to finish school. And she said, "Do you have any Jewish background?" I said, "Yeah, a bit," you know. And I ended up, that was my first experience in the religious school system. And I became absolutely committed to working in the religious school system because I thought it was a fallacy that you hire teachers who didn't know a lot about Judaism. You just wanted to fill the classroom and let the children learn a little Hebrew, a smattering of Hebrew, and have their bar and bat mitzvah, and then do whatever they were going to do. And my feeling was, the more background the teacher had, the more they could get into the kids in a very short way, because they knew what was important, what was critical to focus on. At that point, I ended up then taking another job as well, teaching in two schools, the Orthodox congregation in White Plains, and then the conservative congregation in Mount Kisco, which my children transferred to. And then ultimately decided that I wanted to run my own show, and ended up applying for a position in a Reconstructionist congregation in White Plains, Bet Am Shalom, which was a wonderful place to work. It had at that time a head of the congregation who was its ritual director, because he still didn't have his rabbinic degree. And that was my introduction to Rob Torin, who was an early graduate of the academy. When I was interviewing for this position at Bet Am Shalom, I had the initial interview, and people were wondering why somebody with my extensive background wanted to teach or work in the religious school system. And I explained to them, and then why did I want to work and teach in a Reconstructionist congregation? And I explained to them that I didn't really know that I fit into any of the movements, that I saw the good in each of them. They each had their strong points. And then when I came back to be interviewed by the board, because I was recommended to them, I was sitting in the hallway and listening to the dialogue. And the head of the search committee was saying, "This is the most Reconstructionist person that I have ever met," because she doesn't really adhere to any of the particular movements. She's really got parts of all of them and has the same questions that Reconstructionist Judaism has. And I'm saying to myself, interesting, you know, is that what I am? So I've always considered myself to be a Reconservadox Jew, right? Not kind of fitting anywhere. And I became very close over those years with Rob Torrin, who was a wonderful spiritual leader, really insightful, talented, knew how to bring everybody in the congregation into the dialogue. I mean, one of the things that they did that I admired, when somebody had their bar bat mitzvah, it was the parents who did the Dvar Torah. And I thought that was just brilliant. The whole congregation, the whole family was involved in the bar and bat mitzvah. The kids were nervous, the parents were nervous, everything was equalized, and everybody got something out of it. He ran retreats that were just dynamite. Everybody studied together, and he became, in a way, the role model for much of the education I did afterwards. And Rob introduced me to the academy. He was very close with Shohama, who at that point was the head of the academy. And it was Shohama who, in the mid-1980s, early 1980s, I think it was about 1983, invited me to come teach at the academy. And I started off teaching there history, so Jewish history, not necessarily just medieval, and then started also teaching education courses, Jewish education, because by that point, I was running religious schools for a substantial period of time. During my last year at Bet Am Shalom, the synagogue behind me, which was a conservative synagogue, Temple Israel of White Plains, had a very talented principal who was very, very ill. He was diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer, and I knew that he was not going to live long. My husband was an oncologist. I knew what he was facing. The congregation was very supportive, and they wanted to keep him on as principal. And they approached me and asked if I would be willing to double team, since the synagogues were literally back to back. And I ended up being their acting principal along with Lou, their principal at the time, and running the synagogue at the school at Bet Am Shalom, with the agreement with Bet Am Shalom that I would not then jump to the other congregation and take another position. And then at the end of that year, Lou had passed away, and Lou Engelstein, and I ended up getting a call from Park Avenue Synagogue. And they asked if I would be willing to come and to take the position there as principal of Park Avenue Synagogue Religious Schools, which was a big job. It covered the nursery school, it went on to adult education. It was the whole educational program. And I would start with the elementary school and then build up. And then I met my other role model, who had some contact also with the academy. I hate to say that I'm blocking on the name now, but I am, it'll come to me. But he also ended up being a role model in terms of how to involve people in Judaism. Not to push them, not to force them. They had to come of their own volition, even if they were high school students. And the high school students had to attend the high school because they wanted to be there. They couldn't be forced there by their parents. It was a wonderful school. The elementary school was very intense. Kids had to come 3 days a week, and they had to come. Otherwise, they didn't graduate. Or I sent them to another school where it was a 1-day or a 2-day-a-week program. And what a gift that was, right? You're running a religious school and you're telling the kids, you can't stay here unless you do this. And started using a lot of techniques that I had picked up initially from Rob, and then had picked up along the way from others. I worked with very talented teachers there, Misha Avramov, who was the head of Project Ezra, who was also teaching there, and continued my relationship with the academy. So even while I was running these extensive education programs, I was continuing to give at least 1 day a week where I would, or several hours a week where I would teach 1 or 2 classes at the academy. Because I thought what they were doing was so unique, and it was a unique population of students that you were working with. You were working with students who literally had a calling, who had completed 1 stage of their life and decided that they were ready to go on to something else, to build something else. Some of the students were in their 60s, Some of them were in their 30s. They were electing to go to the academy, which was even a struggling institution then. They were housed in the Reconstructionist congregation on West 86th Street, the mother of Reconstructionist congregations, right? And I loved the atmosphere there. I hadn't been trained in the type of spirituality that was being offered at the academy. It was kind of an otherworldly experience, listening to Shohama. Some of the things I was comfortable with, some not. I still remember when I first met Aura, when she started at the academy, both of us would kind of, we'd get into these circles where you held hands and you had to share all of your most intimate thoughts, and she and I would look at each other, and it was like not what we were raised with. But I was always very spiritual. I mean, when I prayed, when I davened, I was really praying. I would remember how my family prayed. And the academy spoke to that in a way that other institutions didn't, not at that time. So it merged a lot for me that was very important. And it was a haven, it was a home, it was a family. And it was something that I maintained in each position that I took. I think even during, I had taken a 3-year sabbatical after I completed my tenure at Park Avenue Synagogue. After 5 years, I decided that I really needed time off. It was, I was the personality that was working 100 hours a week and literally burnt out. And the last year I was at Park Avenue Synagogue, my mother had taken very ill. She passed away. I had been doing these retreats with children traveling around the country, something that I had picked up from my predecessor. And I just needed time off. And I decided what I always wanted to do was to study Catholic theology. So I went to Fordham University. So here I have a degree, PhD in Judaic Studies. I had taken, as I mentioned, my master's at Yeshiva University. I had to go to Yeshiva University because my grandfather was one of the Rosh Yeshivas there. He was a Rosh Yeshiva at the beginning of the establishment of Yeshiva University. That was where I had to go, not realizing that I was going to have to deal with the fact that I was the first woman there. I was the first woman in Bernard Revel, not always the greatest thing to do. But then I went to NYU, and here all of a sudden I had this calling. I wanted to understand Catholic theology. And then when I came back to the academy, because I did take a break from the academy for a few years then, but then Sammy Barth was very involved in the academy. He was the assistant dean with Shohama Wiener. He brought a very different feel to the academy. He was also very, very spiritual, kind-hearted man, very knowledgeable, and got me involved in certain things that were really a gift. Sammy was very involved with interreligious dialogue, and he had let me know one year, he advised me to go to this ingathering of Christians, Muslims, and Jews in Koblenz, Germany. It was a wonderful experience. It was a 1-week retreat where you really lived together. You learned how each community prayed, what the differences were, what the similarities were, what the hopes were in terms of people really being able to speak to each other and deal with each other. And then when I came back to the academy, I started teaching interreligious studies as well. Really Christianity and Judaism, because I don't know much about Islamic traditions. I made a lot of close friends from the, from the students. Linda Targan remains a friend, Joyce Reinitz remains a friend. They were wonderful, and they were so intent, and they brought a whole world of experience into how they were studying Torah, because they were always able to draw on their background, their life background, either as accountants or as attorneys. You were dealing with such a vast experience base. You had one person there who was an orthodontist that Shohama met when we were housed at the Reconstructionist congregation. And he became a student at the academy. So people were being culled from all over. And then the academy went through a very, very difficult transitional period. I think it was, already mid-90s. And it was the transition from Shohama being dean and Sammy being involved in the institution to, I guess, the next step of the vision for the Academy. And the struggle with how to keep the founders of the Academy involved, how to pay them proper respect, and how to have the Academy move to its next stage. But it was a very painful period. I think transition like that is always very, very painful. Here my husband and I have founded this institution. So really I left the Academy with really deep regret because the last 3 years before Mark and I founded the museum in 2001, I was teaching at Fordham University, and I was teaching also interreligious studies there and how faith can also cross over into critical thinking. I was teaching there and I was teaching at the Academy, and at that point the Academy had made me a professor. I was their first professor of education and Jewish religious thought. It was a question, do they name me? Because at Fordham I was a professor of theology, an associate professor of theology. But theology is kind of not a very Jewish title to use, so how do you, okay. So it was Jewish religious thought, became that. And I continued teaching there, and I was teaching there pretty much full time. I was putting in about 15 hours a week and meeting with students, and at that time Lisa Klinger-Cantor was there, and she was just like this amazing, sparkling personality. And Ora was just coming in, and it was like, okay, what do I do now? So first I gave up Fordham University, and then I couldn't sustain establishing this place, dealing with construction issues and the development of the education program and continuing at the Academy. So that was a very, very painful separation. And I still relish it when I get calls from students at the Academy. Doing this interview brings me back. There's good and bad. And as I say, when you establish a new place, the Academy's not new. It's been around for a very long time. But taking a place, for example, like this and saying, okay, what's the next step? So you feel like you have an obligation to the community you've nurtured. There's an obligation to pluralistic Judaism that the Academy has, which is part of, I think, the sustaining factor. We have to keep it going because this is a community we're servicing that has no other place. This is a community that can service congregations that are not part of the Orthodox, conservative, Reconstructionist placement process. They're not part of that. So how do they get their rabbis? How do you get a rabbi who goes into a small community and can service people who are from Orthodox background, conservative background, Reconstructionist background, from all over the gamut of Judaism, to those who have had no Jewish background, to those who are intermarried, to those who have converted? How do you reach all of those community? The rabbis and the cantors at the Academy were being trained specifically for that. And that was very important. I feel that here. How do I sustain a place which now has nurtured a community? We have wonderful education programs. The city of Peekskill has changed enormously since the museum was started. Not completely due to us, but certainly we've been a contributing factor. How do we keep that going? After Mark and I are no longer involved here, how do you continue that legacy and that responsibility to a community? I mean, when the institution was opened in Boston, okay, is that, a competition for a population that we're both servicing? When they opened in LA, is that competition for us? Well, no, maybe it's a growing of this movement that speaks to a broader Jewish community that needs more, that looks to the spiritual aspect that's always been an important part of the Academy, and that goes beyond. So one of the overlaps that I see with the Academy, and one of the strengths that I was able to bring to it during the last years that I was there, was this interest in the arts, in contemporary art. and in the ability of conceptual art to really bring out a lot of religiosity. And during my years, both at the academy as well as in the different religious school systems, I became very involved in an organization called CAGE, which has now been resuscitated. And I was asked to do, I think it was in 1986 maybe, I was asked to be the program director for CAGE New York, which was being held in Hofstra. And because I was involved in it, I wanted a substantive art program that was part of what was going on at CAGE. And I did it in a very, very different way. I had involved 3 artists at that time who would come and would speak to the text, problems that might find in the text, especially when it came to women's issues, and how the artists would present that in their work. So the 3 artists I worked with were Helene Alon, Hope Sandro, and Mirala Euclides. Mirala, Orthodox, dealing with how garbage can be recycled to create artwork. She did through video and through performance. Helene Alon, who really spoke to her background as a very Orthodox woman, married at a very young age to an Orthodox rabbi. And she was taking a look at feminist issues and how women were really absent in much of the biblical story and how she could place them into the story now. Very important artist. And Hope Sandro, who was dealing with movement, with hands and how hands can express religiosity. And at that time I involved Sherry Kohler Fox's husband. He was one of the scholars who did presentations there, and the presentations were done in collaboration with the artists. So the artists were there, the scholars would do their presentation, and then the audience would follow up with a participatory action that would relate to the art. I felt that because we were dealing with a pluralistic population in the academy, because we didn't fit into a niche, there was an amazing opportunity to create our own sacred spaces, doing it through the vision of the congregants. And I started integrating a lot of that discussion into a lot of the classes that I was teaching. And then Shohama and the rest of the faculty came together, and we were trying to decide on a retreat topic. And we decided on one retreat that would deal specifically with the sacred arts. I had been working with certain teachers in my school systems that brought very unique art perspectives to the religious schools. Artists that were dealing much more with performance work, with conceptual work, with spiritual work, and integrating, you know, whether it was prayer, how can you pull apart a prayer so that it becomes yours, and then how can you present it artistically? And the retreat would focus on that. So I pulled on this one amazing artist, Ani Masing, who studies Kabbalah. He spent years, he started off as a rock singer, 18 years old, left the rock industry and ended up going to an ashram in India and studying for 7 years there. And then his guru told him it's time to go back to the Jewish community. And Donnie was a spiritual leader. I don't recall if he ever got a rabbinic degree. He has a congregation, came and played his guitar, and he would deal with the spirituality through music and through drama. I brought in art teachers for the retreat who would deal with the creation of artworks, weavings, how you make a talit, how you create a religious housing that's yours. And then I addressed the issue of how you could canvas a congregation and find out what memories the congregation had. And I drew on some of the works that I was integrating into retreats I was doing at my school. So how do you come into a congregation where you're dealing with people from Orthodox, conservative, Reconstructionist, whatever background they are, and draw on what they remember of their childhood, and then create a sacred space based on those memories. And we built dioramas. That retreat was amazing because people started thinking even about having, you know, water coming through their congregation, you know, drawing on some of the congregations that had rabbis that were, you know, had that kind of foresight to create these meditative gardens behind them that could, you know, have water running through it, so you could use your imagination that way. That was an amazing retreat that directly drew on my background in the arts and how artists could do that. And I refer to this one artist who, his name is Dakota Jackson. His Jewish name was Malin, right? And he took that on. He was a famous furniture designer, but he had designed a synagogue that looked like all of the walls were like parchment and an unfurled Torah. So you walked into this space and you were completely surrounded by the Torah. And that became one of the models that we drew on. And I know that when Sandy Kilstein had contacted me and said, could you come back and talk a little bit? We have this weekend retreat for the Academy. Can you talk a little bit about that retreat? And it was like, you know, coming back to that experience. Sometimes you remember history by revisiting your own history and, you know, starting to draw on what you did that you felt was so special. That was a very special experience at the Academy. And of course we were able to draw on, you know, the musical side of it through the cantorial school, and that was great. So one of my fondest memories of the Academy was that particular retreat.